Next presentation is Dr. Neal Benowitz. Unfortunately, Dr. Neal Benowitz had a previous commitment, so he couldn't be here in person, but he recorded his session. I'm going to introduce you a little bit of his CV. Regardless of him not being here in person, please ask your questions in the Q&A. We're going to try our other presenters to answer them. If not, we are going to share them with Dr. Benowitz through his email. So Dr. Benowitz is an MD and is a professor of medicine at the University of California in San Francisco. His research focuses on the human pharmacology of nicotine in relation to pathogenesis of an individual differences in vulnerability to tobacco-related diseases. He has served on a number of national and international committees addressing issues on tobacco-related diseases and smoking cessation, including several committees sponsored by the Institute of Medicine.
Hello, I'm Neal Benowitz from the University of California, San Francisco. I'm sorry that I cannot be with you live on Zoom today. I'm going to talk about nicotine addiction from biology to regulatory policy. These are my conflict of interest statements. So the first point is that tobacco combustion products are the predominant cause of smoking-related disease and premature death. Combustion generates numerous oxidants, pro-inflammatory chemicals, and carcinogens, which cause the harm. But nicotine is key because it is what drives combusted tobacco use. So cigarettes are so harmful, as well as other combusted tobacco products, because they're highly addictive. Addiction means loss of control of drug use. 70% of cigarette smokers are daily smokers and rarely go through a day without smoking. And addiction drives use despite perceptions or actual harm. Let me go through a little bit about the biology of nicotine addiction. So nicotine, like many other psychoactive drugs, works because it acts on systems that are meant for other chemicals in the body. In the case of nicotine, it's a structural analog of acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is the most dominant neurotransmitter, which means a chemical that transmits signals from one nerve to the next nerve in the body. And nicotine acts on the same receptors meant for acetylcholine. Nicotine acts predominantly presynaptically. It means it acts on other nerves to enhance their activity or their secretion of neurotransmitters. Nicotine increases the release of dopamine, which is key, causes pleasure, appetite suppression, and dopamine is key to all addictive behaviors. It activates the brain reward center. Nicotine also releases norepinephrine, which causes arousal and appetite suppression. Acetylcholine itself, which causes arousal and cognitive enhancement. Glutamate, that is involved in learning and memory enhancement. Serotonin, that's involved in mood modulation, appetite suppression. Beta endorphin and GABA, which reduce anxiety and tension. Smokers augment the release of these neurotransmitters depending on what they're doing. And so a smoker can say, my cigarette helps me be alert first thing in the morning. It helps me concentrate throughout the day when I'm trying to focus. At the same time, if I'm stressed, it helps me feel less stressed. It helps me relax before I go to bed. So people, in fact, use nicotine to modulate mood and arousal, as well as experiencing pleasure throughout the day. And when the brain is exposed to nicotine for large periods of time, it adapts. So the receptors in the brain change, the structure changes. Here's an example. The Guinness World Record holder for smoking cigarettes can smoke 800 cigarettes, which would be a lethal dose of nicotine for everyone else in the world, but his brain is tolerant. when the brain is tolerant and then you take nicotine away, you have withdrawal symptoms. And these include psychological distress, so irritability, anger, impatience and anxiety, difficulty concentrating, hunger, eating, and weight gain, hedonic dysregulation. So hedonia refers to pleasure, and hedonic dysregulation means things that were once pleasurable no longer seem pleasurable. And of course, tobacco craving. The smokers tend to smoke in a consistent way. So they smoke their cigarette first thing in the morning. Nicotine is absorbed quickly, goes to the brain, has its effects. This produces arousal, mood modulation, and pleasure. Even within the day, tolerance develops from each cigarette, and then physical dependence, which means withdrawal symptoms. Then one experiences the drug withdrawal symptoms. There's a craving for nicotine to self-medicate this, and the next cigarette is smoked. And individual smokers tend to smoke the same amount of nicotine day to day to day. We've studied this looking at cotinine, which is a biomarker of nicotine exposure, and smokers have very consistent cotinine levels over years. So in terms of reducing nicotine content of cigarettes, I want to introduce two tobacco company documents, because tobacco company documents were really the beginning of the nicotine reduction concept. The first one is from 1959 from British American Tobacco Company, which stated to lower nicotine too much might end up destroying the nicotine habit in a large number of consumers and prevent it from ever being acquired by new smokers. So prevent it from being acquired by new smokers is really key. The second document was a 1975 Philip Morris conference document from a psychologist named William Dunn, which says the cigarette should be conceived not as a product, but as a package. The product is nicotine. Think of the cigarette pack as a storage container for a day's supply of nicotine. Think of a puff of smoke as the vehicle of nicotine, and the cigarette the most optimized dispenser of smoke. So this is clearly pharmaceutical language, making it clear that the cigarette is a drug delivery system and the drug is nicotine. Well, in the definition of a drug from the FDA is as follows. It's an article other than food intended to affect the structure or any function of the body of man or other animals. The tobacco company documents that were released in the 1980s, 1990s made it very clear that industry research showed that nicotine was intended to affect the function of the body of man. Here is a 1994 newspaper clipping of FDA Commissioner David Kessler. And he was testifying about the fact that tobacco companies had suppressed their own research showing that nicotine was addictive in animal studies. And he also proposed the concept of removing nicotine from cigarettes in order to provide smokers with a free choice of whether to continue smoking or to quit. This came in the context of conversations that he had had with scientists, including myself and Jack Henningfield. In 1994, Jack Henningfield and I, who had both been interested in nicotine addiction and its control of cigarette smoking for years, published a commentary in the New England Journal of Medicine called Establishing a Nicotine Threshold for Addiction. And in fact, in 1995, the FDA did rule that nicotine in cigarettes and smokeless tobacco is a drug, and that these products are nicotine delivery devices under the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. So this allowed the FDA to say that tobacco products are under their jurisdiction, but when they tried to get authority to regulate these products, it was overturned by the courts, who said this had to be something done by Congress. And you'll hear more about that later. So again, to get back to the nicotine reduction idea, the initial rationale, and David Kessler was a pediatrician, so he was really interested in this, was to prevent children who experiment with smoking from becoming addicted later in life, to provide them a freedom of choice about whether to continue or not. And another benefit would be that addicted smokers, most of whom would like to quit, will move towards cessation. So there's some assumptions that were implicit in the nicotine reduction strategy. The first is that there's a threshold nicotine exposure level that is necessary to sustain nicotine addiction. And I'll show you in the next slide what our estimates were. And the second is that it's technically feasible to manufacture cigarettes with low enough nicotine content to fall below the threshold for most people. And this was known to be feasible either by extracting nicotine or by breathing low nicotine tobacco. And third, that smokers would not fully compensate for reduced nicotine content cigarettes by smoking more cigarettes or smoking each cigarette more intensively. And this has been shown empirically, and you may see this data later. So in terms of the threshold that Jack Henfield and I proposed, this was based on studies of what we thought were non-addicted smokers and estimated their nicotine intake based on cotinine levels of 5 milligrams per day. Cigarette contains between 10 to 15 milligrams of nicotine in the tobacco rod, and we said the maximum that person could get from a cigarette puffing as hard as possible would be 40%. And assuming someone was willing to smoke 30 cigarettes per day, we estimated an absolute limit of 0.4 to 0.5 milligrams nicotine content per cigarette. And this is actually what has been shown empirically in research since that time. So the original proposal was to gradually reduce the nicotine content of cigarettes to make nicotine less available from cigarettes, but to also have other clean nicotine sources available for people who did not want to quit smoking. And then over time, they could either continue using nicotine in a less harmful way, or they could reduce their nicotine. This concept was based on common practice in treating people with substance use disorders, where one tends to gradually reduce the intake of the addictive substance over time to minimize the severity of withdrawal symptoms. So let me end just showing some of the early studies that we did looking at progressive reduction of nicotine content of cigarettes. This was a study we published in 2007. So in this study, smokers were switched to cigarettes containing either 12, 8, 4, 2, or 1 milligram of nicotine. And this shows plasma cotinine levels. This was 1 week at a time over 6 weeks. This shows plasma cotinine levels, which again is a measure of nicotine intake. And you can see that over 6 weeks, there was a 75% reduction. So they markedly reduced their cotinine intake. There was then 4 weeks of follow-up where people could smoke their own cigarettes, and they continued to take in only about 50% of the nicotine that they had used at baseline, suggesting it was a reset of their desirable daily nicotine intake. Here's another slide from that study showing cigarettes per day. So there was some reduction of cigarettes per day during the tapering itself from 12 to 1 milligrams, but in follow-up, they smoked 50% of as many cigarettes. This was own cigarettes ad lib as they had before reduction, suggesting that there really was a change of the individual nicotine self-administration set point, consistent with a lower level of addiction. And these are some of the quotes from our participants. I no longer feel the need to have coffee and cigarettes first thing in the morning. I'm experiencing less craving. Smoking these cigarettes are like quitting, and therefore I might as well quit. And smoking is losing its pleasure. So clearly, these are reports that suggest that the addictive qualities of these cigarettes are markedly reduced. So conclusions. First is that addiction to nicotine sustains cigarette smoking. The cigarette delivery system causes most of the harm rather than the nicotine. Reducing the nicotine content of cigarettes reduces the addictiveness of cigarettes. And finally, the result of a national nicotine reduction policy would be preventing children from becoming addicted smokers and giving established smokers greater freedom to stop smoking when they decide to quit. So I'm sorry that I won't be there live to answer questions, but if someone has questions, they can feel free to email me. Thank you for your attention.